Good evening, folks, and welcome to our Sunday school lesson tonight. We are going to do something a little bit different today and look at some kind of contemporary subject for us as well. And it's unusual for us because of the way COVID's worked out, and everybody's kind of timid about talking and stuff like that with us being broadcasting live and that sort of thing. But please, if you got questions, I always think that the best way for me to learn is to ask questions and get responses and do like that. So if you got questions, please bring those up. And if you're online watching with us and you have a question, don't be afraid to put it in the comments. Somebody will be watching, and we'll try to get that. We got a little bit of feedback we're working on. So we'll get started on our this evening's Sunday school. So for most of us, February 20th was just another day. Anybody here have a birthday that happens to be on February 20th? Nobody? If you're a foodie, we do this at work with our cafeterias and food staff and stuff like that. They follow food celebrations, those national kind of days. February 20th was National Cherry Pie Day, if you didn't know that. It was also National Love Your Pet Day. I didn't know they had one day you're supposed to love your pet. The rest of the days you can just hate them and kick them around, I guess. And then National Muffin Day was also on February 20th. Very interesting, those 3 days line up. And if you have a birthday, so be it. But also, since February of 2008, February 20th has been celebrated annually as the World Day of Social Justice, as declared by the General Assembly of the United Nations. In part, as you go and look at that declaration reads that the General Assembly of the United Nations recognizes that social development and social justice are indispensable for the achievement and maintenance of peace and security within and among nations, and that in turn social development and social justice cannot be attained in the absence of peace and security or in the absence of respect for all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So they acknowledge, or they state, that if you're going to have social justice, you must have peace and security with among nations. It goes on to say it recognizes that broad-based and sustainable economic growth in the context of sustainable development is necessary to sustain social development and social justice. So you need economic growth for social justice to happen. And then it goes on, finally it says, further recognizes that globalization and interdependence are opening new opportunities through trade, investment, capital flows, and advances in technology, including IT, for the growth of the world economy and the development and improvement of living standards around the world, while at the same time there remain serious challenges, including serious financial crisis, insecurity, poverty, exclusion, and inequality within and among societies, and considerable obstacles to further integration and full participation in the global economy for developing countries, as well as some countries with economies in transition. So to boil that all down, it says that poor nations cannot be as socially just as rich nations, and rich nations cannot be socially just at all if they're not helping out poor nations as we look at this. And so what the United Nations is declaring is that social justice is necessarily part of the world economic machine, and that has to be organized, I'll use that word, to make sure that we have social justice in our economies. Along with that single declaration of the World Day of Social Justice being February 20th of every year, the United Nations have made a number of declarations regarding social justice, including a declaration on social justice for a fair globalization of the world. You need social justice to fairly globalize the world, and we see how the world is globalizing already, right? And it also has a 157-page document which is titled Social Justice in an Open World, the Role of the United Nations. And if that doesn't scare you, not much will, right? But in that document, it says, it teaches us that social and distributive justice are equated and they're unseparated from economic justice, and it's suggested that the distributive and the redistributive aspects of justice do not have to be separated, and they aren't necessarily antagonistic towards each other. Now, that's a bunch of mumbly that goes on to talk about social justice, and the reason this is ending up being a civic lesson is because we need to define these so that we understand what we're talking about when we say just social justice and what the people around us are talking about when we use the terms social justice. Because if we don't understand what they're saying, and we're speaking completely different languages, which most often is the case, we don't understand their definitions, we cannot address these causes or these things of social justice directly or on the same page, and we end up butting heads all the time, which is consistently what happens. And so our study in the next couple of weeks is social justice and the Bible, right? And that's what we're looking at, and how it plays out. Can we actually call it social justice or whatever it is? So going to those terms, the first one I mentioned was distributive justice. Distributive justice, is that up there? So what we see is that distributive justice are those laws, the institutions, the policies, all the things that we use to make a society that result in different, what they call distributions of benefits and burdens across members of society. Not everybody, so to speak, has the same access to every single thing that's out there. And the structure of these frameworks are important because this distribution of benefits and burdens we talk about results in them fundamentally affecting people's lives. Every person's life is affected by the distributive principles of justice that this nation, this city, this state uses, right? And so when we look at arguments that the framework around that, what it results from, it says that they are morally preferable. That's what it says, right? Go ahead in the next slide. Keep it. Yeah, arguments about which frameworks or resulting distributions are morally preferable constitute the topic of distributive justice. And that's a key word there, that word morally, right? Morally. Goes on to say that the principles of distributive justice are therefore been thought of as providing moral guidance, next slide there, for the political processes and structures that affect the distribution of benefits and burdens, and the principles which do offer this kind of moral guidance on distribution, regardless of the terminology that they employ, regardless of what they say, should be considered principles of distributive justice. And that's all from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So again, the key words to take out about this is distributive justice is something that they call a moral obligation. A moral obligation, right? And so we talked about distributive. The other thing we talked about in this whole declaration of the world nation, the United Nations, what they said was economic justice, right? And so the next thing we see is economic justice, which touches the individual person as well as all of society, right? And that economic justice encompasses, again, the moral principles that guide us in designing our economic institutions is what they say, right? And so again, these institutions, each of them determine how a person earns a living, how a person gets money, how a person goes on to make their stamp in the world, so to speak, right? And so the ultimate purpose of economic justice is to free each person to engage creatively in, as it says, the unlimited work beyond the economics, that of the mind and the spirit. So if we are bound in any way by our financial position, our economic position, then you and I as human beings cannot meet our full potential in the mind of social justice, right? So if our life is built upon earning a living, we are not socially just in our lives, right? You are a victim of injustice of this world. If you have to work to make a dime to put food on your table, beyond that which anybody else has to work to make a dime to put food on their table, you are a victim of social injustice. And that's a moral principle unto them. And so then what we find in the next thing is that social justice then is that virtue, the virtue that guides us in creating those organized institutions, right? And so when these social institutions, when they're organized, they provide us with the access, which is the word we hear everybody saying, the equality for what is good for everybody, both individually and as a group or as a city or as a nation, right? And social justice also imposes on each one of us, it puts on each one of us a personal responsibility to collaborate with others. I think that's in the next part, yeah. At whatever level the common good in which we participate. Again, keywords that we see, right? And so again, when we talk about social justice, you and I might think one thing, but this is what's going on in the mind of, we'll use the term loosely, social justice warriors. I don't want to use that disparagingly, but that's the kind of thing that's going on in the mind. And when the conversation is being held about social justice, they're looking at these distributive principles as moral guidelines, the economic justice as moral guidelines, and social justice itself is a virtue for them upon which they use it as a feedback loop or as a critique of what's going on in the world today to ensure that each and every person, each and every nation has the same access, the same opportunity to thrive, to be able to do the things other than just scratch and go by day to make a living. Any questions about that? We'll learn a little bit more as we go on. So what we see, and as I looked at this over and over again with a bunch of different things, I've come to the conclusion that what has been built out of this framework is a humanist religion of justice, right? It's a humanist religion of justice. Their God is that distributive justice, right? It's that big overarching thing that draws out the morals of society. It says this is what a just society looks like. These distributive principles of justice, the moral principles, that's the word they use, right? The moral principles. That's their God, this distributive justice. And just to be clear, distributive justice does not mean redistribution all the time. In some senses of the word it does, but distribution also means just the way you make your money, make your living, and what you get from society, what you put in. So that's the first. Their God is this distributive justice. And then their Christ become one of any sorts of thing. We're talking specifically about economic justice right now, but it could just as well be climate justice. It could be racial justice. It could be any other thing. Any one of these justices that we're going to talk about, these are their Christ. Those are the things that are sacrificed, sometimes individually, sometimes by people groups, sometimes by nation. These are the things that are sacrificed for the greater good of mankind. And that's their Christ. And then the social justice itself, that virtue, becomes a kind of Holy Spirit which corrects those injustices, that leads them away from the direction they're going and puts them in a direction that leads them in the right way. And so social justice, again, this whole principle becomes some sort of religion to them. It's a fervor within them. And that's why when we're confused about the fervor these people hold, it's because we don't understand what's going on in their mind. And so the argument that's in the mind of these people who look at social justice in this way, who use the humanist reasoning behind it, see it as a moral obligation, just as much a moral obligation as you and I see Christianity in our lives today. So those people in this world, the humanists who don't have a God, whose God is this world, see social justice and this justice system we're talking about as their moral framework for a free and a just society. Does that make sense to everybody? So now when you're talking about different political alignments and different works going on and different benefits and things like that, they don't see them just as a political shill, I'll use that word. They don't see them as a political ploy. And while a lot of people are using the term as a power grab today, what's really going on is not that. What's really going on is the enactment of their religion, to put it that way. They're really going out there and doing the work of the evangelist for their God, that God being justice. Does that make sense? That's why we see the fervor that's going on today. And so when we're confused about that, it's because we don't understand. To us, it's just to us who have gods, to us who have a dedication to the principles of the Bible and stuff like that, to us it's just words, it's just polity. But to them it's not. And so we need to be careful about that as we deal with people, right? And so what we're going to look at, as I've said already, is social justice and the Bible. What it means to us and how it is being applied into our lives as American today is a very real concern, right? And as we see that larger emphasis being played out on the world, its ideals are impacting us as a church immensely. Each and every day we're asked hard questions about social justice, right? And so the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, should social justice apply into the church? Does it? How can we be socially just? Or even can we be at all? Does social justice align with the Bible at all, right? Can we see it in action biblically? Is there even a biblical form of social justice? Those are questions we have to ask ourselves. And so while we may deride that term, we may not like it too much, we need to understand its origins, we need to understand its implications, and we need to understand how it's being played out in the world around us today so that you and I can react accordingly and do such in a biblical manner. Make sense? Any questions or comments before we move on? Again, please don't be afraid just because we're on the internet. All right, so just to give credit where credit is due, the largest part of the informational part of what I'm going to talk about here came from an article I found called What Christians Should Know About Social Justice, written by a guy named Joe Carter in 2018. So that's where the information, all the Bible stuff and a lot of the stuff I put in there is my own works, but I just want to make sure that we got the correct credit where credit was due. So if you go to the next slide, we ask ourselves, where did social justice originate? Where did it come from, right? What's it come from? And actually, social justice, you might be surprised to learn, is actually a religious terminology. It came from this Jesuit priest named Luigi Tapparelli Desaglio. I guess that's how you pronounce his name. And he coined the term in about the mid-1800s, 1840s or so. And he based that concept, his concept, on the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. He took those and he rolled it into this term he called social justice, right? And then the next part, you see that referred to the ordinary and the traditional conception of justice applied to what they say constitutional arrangements of society. So Luigi Tapparelli Desaglio's concept of justice and social justice align pretty much with what you and I would see as justice. Treating people right, doing the right thing, and that sort of thing. And we'll get to that a little bit more as we go on. At least 4 popes were directly influenced by Tapparelli's teachings, or they had students that wrote influential encyclicals, which are what the Roman folks call letters to us. And in 1931, Pius the 11th, he actually wrote this. I'm not going to try to pronounce that one, but that encyclical, and that actually officially adopted social justice as part of the Catholic doctrine. In fact, according to the Compendium on Social Doctrine of the Church, a large part of the Church's social teachings is solicited and determined by social questions to which social justice is the proper answer. And again, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, social justice is ensured by society when it provides the conditions that allow associations or individuals to obtain what is their due according to their nature and their vocation. Social justice is linked to the common good and the exercise of authority. So again, we see some of these common words being played out in these definitions. The common good, right? Associations, individuals to obtain what is their due, having that sort of thing. Understand that. And so when we look at these teachings that Tapparelli went with, and even what the Catholic Church teaches, we are not far off, you and I, if we agree with social justice in that manner. And it's not that big of a difference. But in the 1970s, 1971, there was a liberal author named John Rawls. He wrote The Theory of Justice in 1971, and this is the key that brought about what we know today as liberal social justicism, or whatever you want to call it, right? And he wrote this, that our concern is solely with the basic structure of society and its major institutions, and therefore with the standard cases of social justice. And so John Rawls took these principles of Tapparelli, of the Catholic Church, and he applied them specifically to the economies of the world. And I can tell you that after looking at this for the past couple of weeks, that this one book and its principles that are written in there are the key to what we know today as social justice. So if you're really concerned and really want to know about it, if you took a couple of days and read his book, it might take you a month or so, to read his book, then you would understand where today what we talk about social justice come in. And so we go on, ask ourselves the question, what is social justice? What is social justice? And we talk about words and how they mean and stuff like that. We think of social justice as one way, and we know what we've learned about justice and what the Bible teaches, and we'll get through that a little bit more. But we see that words have primary meanings, what they literally say, what they're defined as, but they also have an emotional association, right? That meaning gets changed as people feel certain ways about them. And, you know, the English language is fluid. We all know that, right? Most of us grew up at a time in our age when bad meant good, right? oh, that was bad, right? And that was the connotation. That's not the definition, right? The definition is bad is bad. Bad is not good. But we walked around and we called things that were good bad. Oh man, those things are bad. That was the emotional association with it, right? That's the difference between the denotation, the literal thing, and the connotation. And you go back one because I want to make sure we understand that. And so what happens here is because of that fluidity in these natures, the terms actually change over time, and the emotional association of social justice, it overtook the primary meaning of it, right? And that's the next slide. And then we see how much emphasis has been put on the emotional part of it. And then following on, we see that Jonah Goldberg, he's a political journalist, he said, social justice has become code for good things no one needs argue for and no one dare be against. So that's what social justice has turned to, right? And that's what is happening in this world. Good things that no one needs argue for and no one dare be against. You can't open your mouth or say anything about them, right? Think of the terms we hear often bandied about. Xenophobia, right? Homophobia, racism, misogyny, Islamophobia. Go on, pick any of those words, any of those terms that are bandied about. And while we don't argue that in their primary definition that they exist, there are racists in this world. There are misogynists in this world. There are people who are xenophobic in this world. That exists, right? But social justice has taken that, and for the most part, they have been emotionally weaponized to prevent any form of discourse that might lead to some true solutions. And they use those words to squash any opposition to their proponent's cause. Just today, I read, and I'm trying not to get too political, but I mean, this is just an obvious example of what's going on. Pardon me, talking about getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate. And I read, word for word, where this senator said that we are going to make the filibuster, he said this, we're going to make the filibuster racist to put pressure on those people who don't want to get rid of it. They're going to make it racist. They're going to call it racist. And that's exactly what we're talking about, social justicism, right? That's the outcome of it. They're taking these things, again, to use his words, good things that no one needs argue for and no one dare be against. How is the filibuster racist? You know, but again, I'm trying to stay part of that. So part of the problem is that the root word for this, which is justice is also misunderstood or used in different ways. And so as we look at the meaning of it, what we find from the Oxford Dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary, is that social justice is justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunity, and privileges within a society. That's what we've been talking about, how you get what you want or need and how other people do that. So justice in those terms. But then it goes on to define justice itself kind of vaguely as the quality of being fair and reasonable. That's what justice is in of itself. More usefully, if we look at the next one, we see from the Institutes of Justinian, I'm not going to go back to where that all comes from, but it's a old Roman definition. It defines justice as the set and constant purpose which gives to every man his due. Again, makes a lot of sense. Goes on to say, the philosopher here, Michael Sandel, he said it's giving people what they deserve, where what they deserve depends on their virtue and depends on sorting out hard questions about the good life. So again, you get out of life what you put into it. That's social justice. That's not a bad definition of social justice. You get out of life, you get back from life, you get back from the economic or whatever society or system you're working in, that which you put into it. And that makes sense. From a Christian perspective, if we look at this guy here, what's his name? Gideon Strauss. Yep, Gideon Strauss. He's the academic dean. He's the associate professor of worldview studies at the Institute for Christian Studies. He says, justice can be defined as when all God's creatures receive what is due them and contribute out of their uniqueness to our common existence. And so from this, he sees a flow, two streams of justice, a public justice and a social justice. And the public justice is that political aspect, right? We all need it. That's what God set government institutions up for that. The political aspect of it is what he's working on. And that's the work of citizens and political office bearers to shape this public life that we live for the common good again. And then he goes on to talk about social justice as a civil society counterpart, the non-political organizations that promote justice. That's the church. That's civic organizations and that sort of thing. And so these things don't run counter to what you and I at the root believe what social justice is or should be, right? And so that's what we understand. And so when we talk about what is social justice and how it applies to our lives, what we find is that it is really, in and of itself, in its primary definition, not a bad thing. Not a bad thing to want to go out and do right and do good for everybody so that everybody is able to work and do that sort of thing. So the question we need to understand from that then is, what is biblical justice? The biblical concept of justice, right? If we're going to understand how social justice from the worldview, which we just talked about, applies to our lives, then we must understand what the Bible teaches about justice. What the Bible teaches about justice. And so what we find is if we start looking in the Old Testament, primarily the concept of justice is captured in two Hebrew words, which are mishpat and tzedakah, which we'll talk about those here individually. And so the modern concept of justice, which we know about, is found in this word mishpat, and we find it in various forms in the Old Testament, over 200 times. It's most often translated as judgment. Most often translated as judgment. So when we think justice, the Bible translates that as as judgment. That's the way we see it. And its most basic meaning is that it means to treat people equity. It means acquitting or punishing every person on the merits of the case, regardless of race or social status. Anyone who does the same wrong should be given the same penalty. Everybody does that. That's what judgment here means. And so you see in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, we see this verse here, and we see this mishpat going on. And I charge your judges at the time. This is Moses recounting his trip through the wilderness and all that. And at this point, he's recounting where his father-in-law had said, hey, you're doing too much work on your own. You need to appoint yourself 70 judges to help you out with this. And he's recounting that. And he says, I charge your judges at that time, saying, hear the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously between every man and his brother and the stranger that is with him. Ye shall not respect persons in judgment. That's the mishpat we're talking about. But ye shall hear the small as well as the great. Ye shall not be afraid of the face of man. For the judgment, again, the mishpat, is God's. And the cause that is too hard for you, bring it unto me, and I will hear it. So again, this modern concept of justice, judgment, making the right decision, not holding any one person more accountable than another based on the deeds and what's going on. And nor should they take into account who the person is, just to judge fairly, right? But you and I know we see instances of this failure in justice today in all of the political realm, right? Everywhere we see it. Like it or not, believe it or not, there are multiple judgment in the Bible, justice systems active today, depending on your political affiliations, who you are, your personal beliefs. We have perverted the judgment of God in this world. And we're not holding it straight, right? There should be one set of laws for every person in this land. And the law should apply equally to every person across the land. But we see that is not happening, right? And that's an example in the negative of what Moses is talking about here in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, right? And so not only is mishpat this definition, which means translated as judgment, to treat people equally, but it means giving people their rights, giving what them is due, right? In Deuteronomy 18, as we go on and look at that, it directs the priests that they should be supported out of the tabernacle. And this verse 3 of 18, and this shall be the priest's due. That word due there is the same mishpat that we're talking about. Due from the people, from them that offer a sacrifice, whether it be ox or sheep, and they shall give unto the priest the shoulder and the two cheeks and the maw. Let me find where we're at. Okay, mishpat is not then giving people what they are due, whether it be punishment or protection or care. That's the way we're supposed to look at it. It's also, we see it in Numbers chapter 27, verse 4 through 5. Why should the name of our father be done away from among his family, because he hath no son? And this is the daughters of Zelophehad when they went to Moses, because their father died without any sons. And so they were going to lose their inheritance and their name throughout Israel, and they didn't want to see that happen. So they went to him and said, why should this happen? And then he goes on to say, go give unto us therefore a possession among the brethren of our father. And Moses brought their cause. There's that mishpat word we're talking about, before the Lord. He brought that before the Lord. Their cause, their due. And again, that's also talking about justice and judgment and that sort of thing. And so we understand that side of justice on the Hebrew side. Now, if we go on and look at further, there's another word which we mentioned, which is this tzedekah. And if we look at that, we find that it means, it's more often translated as being righteous. It can be translated as be as just, but like I said, it's more often translated as being righteous. We see the word righteous or righteously in the Old Testament, and we tend to assign the terms of morality to it, right? But that's not often the way it means. It also refers to a life of right relationships. And that's the next part we see, a life of right relationships. So when we live righteously, we're again treating everybody fairly. And like I said, we tend to think of the word when we see it in the Bible as morality, sexual chastity, diligence in prayer, Bible study, and those sorts of things. But if you look at it in its connotation as it's used frequently throughout the Bible, we find it referring to how we live day to day with each other, how we conduct our relationships, how everything is done in such a way that everybody reaps the same benefits. Let's use that term, right? And so we're conducted fairly. In fact, we've seen that word in use already back in Deuteronomy. We go and look at just verse 16 there of Deuteronomy. It says, and I charged your judges at that time, saying, here are the causes between your brethren, and judge righteously. That righteously is this tzedekah. Again, the fact that we have a good relationship, we do it correctly, and we do it according to what we've been taught. And so these two words together roughly correspond to what some have called a primary and a rectifying justice. And so the rectifying justice is the mishpat. It corrects the problems, the things that are going wrong, right? It fixes people who are broke. It fixes people who are not paid for or can't care for themselves. It fixes injustices when you break the law or you hurt somebody. That's what mishpat is, and it also provides. And then right next to that is the tzedekah, which is this primary justice, which again is this relational justice. If you think of the great commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and all thy mind. This is the first and the great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That's the New Testament reflection of what this tzedekah, this primary justice, is in the Old Testament. Love our neighbors as ourselves. Love God first, love our neighbors as ourselves. And if we exercise that, then we would find that we would not need the mishpat, the corrective type judgment, because we would be doing what the Lord would have us to do and taking care of one another, right? And so while we find that tzedekah is primarily about being in a right relationship with God, what ends up is a righteous life that is profoundly, without doubt, social. And that's what we're encouraged to do in those two verses we just quoted, that we go out and love the Lord our God and love our neighbor as ourselves, right? We live a social life in this life that God has given us. And we live it righteously, and we live it in justice, and we live it in correct judgment. And then we see the social results of that in people's lives around us. And as we go on, and it's not just the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, we find another word, which is this Greek word, dikaiosune, I think, and it combines the idea of what we see in the Hebrew in the mishpat and the tzedekah. It's most often translated as righteous or righteousness or something along those lines, but it has a definition of justice being that virtue which gives each his due. Again, there's that term we saw in the world about social justice. It's a virtue that gives each his due. And so while you and I, again, read righteousness in the New Testament, we tend to apply that familiar morality to it. It also has this idea of being right or doing things correctly with people. And so where our interpretation may be the righteousness we think about morality, that may not necessarily be the intent of the author as it was written down. For instance, Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, we all know this, very familiar verse. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now on the surface, and I'm guilty of this myself, this is the way I read this forever. For herein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. The goodness of God, the correctness of God. But it's not. Or let's say it's probably not, right? Because it could be the justice of God, right? The judgment of God. For therein is the righteousness, the judgment, the justice of God revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live how? By faith. God judges us based on our faith. And He's done that throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And we did that study in depth in the book of Romans. And we see how God's judgment, His justice applied to us, is done through Christ His Son. And that was even foreshadowed in the Old Testament. And so where we may see this morality, it might be taken as this treatment, this justice of God's character. We see it a little bit more in depth. You'll have to flip here to James chapter 1. Longer passage. I didn't have room to put it on the slide here. So if you'll flip to James chapter 1 and verse 16. We'll see this in a couple of places here. It says, do not err, my beloved brethren. Verse 17, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Now you, again, I was guilty of this as I started looking at this, but you and I may have looked at this and seen it as God, how He treats His people, right? How He treats you and I as Christians, those what we call His children, right? But I don't think that's the actual intent of this verse, right? I believe that James is referring to the goodness of God to all people, regardless of their state of salvation. Do not err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift is above and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, nor neither shadow of turning. He doesn't look one way on the lost than He does on the other. And I back that up with what Christ said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 through 45. He said, ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. Why? For He maketh His sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and He sendeth His rain on the just and on the unjust. And I think that's the principle that should be applied to James chapter 1, verse 17. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above and cometh down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. And then go on down to verse 18. Pardon me. I'm missing a page. Do you have an extra page back there, brother? Following verse 18? No, I need my notes. Sorry about that. Steph, would you bring me my phone, please? So in verse 18, he said, of His own will begat He us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits. A kind of first fruits. Right? And that word first fruits means someone superior in excellence of other of the same class. So he's saying that we are to be the first fruits of His creatures, right? That we are to be better than other people. That was the purpose of His salvation. Yeah, I don't think that ends where I end. So we're in trouble now. So the first fruits of His creatures. And go on in verse 19, he says, wherefore, my beloved, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. What are we talking about here? How God deals, or how we are to deal with people, right? Pardon me while I get to where catch up on my notes over here. So how we are to treat people, right? So again, wherefore, my brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. How we treat people, right? Again, he goes verse 20, for the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness, and he's not talking about the holiness, he's talking about the justice and the judgment of God. The wrath of man worketh not the righteous, the judgment, the justice of God. You and I cannot judge fairly or correctly if we've not done what he's talked about in verse 19, to be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath, right? And so we need to understand that principle. So what the Bible teaches us is that justice is the fair and equal treatment of all people, regardless. In this next slide there, the next slide shows us that regardless of who they are or whatever it is. Go back one. I think you missed a little bit of it. Next slide. I guess not. So biblical justice, again, is the fair and equal treatment of all people, regardless of any appealing or unappealing characteristics, regardless of how they are, who they are, what they've done, what they do, their status in society, whatever they possess, it doesn't matter. Biblical justice is the fair and equal treatment of everyone, right? And it is an attribute of God that should be adopted by all of us, and specifically those of us who are His children, right? And regardless, His children should strive, you and I should endeavor to live justly in our lives. And that's what we're to do. So as we look at social justice and how it lies in this world, we find that it is very much a biblical concept, social justice. Now, we'll talk about how it's applied in the world later, because it is not applied with the same equality that the Bible talks about. But when we put these two words together, we find that it relates. And that's the next part. We talk about how social justice relates to the Bible, to biblical justice, right? And so we see a couple of verses. In the Old Testament, again, we talked about the mishpat and the tzedakah. What you find is that those two words are combined in the same verse about 40 times in the Old Testament. Here's just three of them, right? 2 Samuel 8:15. David reigned over all Israel, and David executed judgment, that mishpat, and justice, tzedakah, unto all his people. Psalm 89, verse 14. Justice and judgment are the habitation of thy throne. Mercy and truth shall go before thy face. Again, he says, to do justice, tzedakah, and judgment, mishpat, is more acceptable to the Lord than to do sacrifice. And so these two words put together form the framework of what we know as social justice. That's the best word that meets it, right? And if we look for an English expression that best conveys the meaning of the combination to those, it is social justice, which is the next part, right? And so it's not only a biblical concept, it is a subset of biblical justice, right? We understand that. It's what goes on. And so we need to understand that social justice is a real biblical concept. It is something that you and I should apply. Maybe not the way the world applies it, but it is something that we should understand and embrace, right? And so claiming that we only need biblical justice and not social justice, or that social justice is somehow separate from biblical justice, it's just semantics is all it is, right? Because these words are in our Bible. These words, the concept is there. And so biblical justice includes all forms of God's justice, God's ordained justice. Anything that He calls just is part of biblical justice. And so whether we talk about economics, racial, climate, or, we'll get into these things as we move on. Whatever we talk about, they are all part and parcel of what God calls justice. The application of those may be incorrect, but we need to understand that. And so when you and I have justice, when we have biblical justice, when we're executing that in our lives should be very much socially just. And we should not deride that term. We should maybe deride the way they use that term, but that term is not unbiblical and is not something that you and I should shy away from. Make sense? Any questions? Again, I apologize for the civic-orientedness of this lesson, but I think it was very important for us to understand the basis of what people are talking about, especially for those who are outside, whose worldview is not based upon biblical views. And it is perverted. I will tell you, just as we talked about how justice is improperly, how we have separate justice systems for different people or different polities or whatever, it's perverted. And people pervert the wisdom of God. It's happened all throughout history. It's going to happen today, and it's going to happen tomorrow and the next year. And we just have to understand what our responsibility is at. And I believe that we could wrap it all up. We could quote two verses I've already quoted. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. This is the first and the great commandment. The second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. If we would appropriate that, anything that goes with social justice that we're talking about today would take care of itself. But this world has rejected Christ. It has rejected God. It has rejected the principles of Christianity that this country was built upon. And what is happening today is a direct result of that. And so as we talk about this, I would encourage you to be willing to share that perspective with your friends and your neighbors. Be willing to tell them about the God who is socially just, who is perfectly just in all things, and not be afraid to discuss the somewhat more stickier topics that arise out of it in the light of Christ, in the light of the Bible, and especially as we go through this and look at the different topics. Next week, we're going to look at the gospel and social justice, Christ and social justice. Well, I've heard a lot of people say Christ was a socialist. That claim has been out there all the time. Christ was a social justice warrior. I've heard that many times. Was he? How did he talk about social justice, though? And how did he apply it in his life? So we'll look forward to that next week. Any questions or comments before we close? All right, we'll pray and be dismissed. Lord, we do thank you again for this day. And again, I pray that you would just help people as we plod through this today to understand the principles in this world that are being applied and how they work towards